The Intergalactic Military Academy's Xenobiology Department had seen worse teaching disasters, though Professor Vex Ka's current lecture on primitive predator classifications was making a strong bid for the Hall of Fame. The crystalline being's prismatic form refracted the classroom's harsh lighting into rainbow fragments that danced across walls lined with specimens from 1,000 worlds, each more nightmarish than the last. And here, Vexka's voice resonated through his mineral throat with all the enthusiasm of grinding stone. We observe the laughable apex predator of Sol 3, Homo sapiens. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a rather ordinary-looking bipedal mammal. Note the complete absence of natural weaponry, the pathetic sensory apparatus, and the ridiculous reliance on tools. Cadet Zeph 9, whose insectoid mandibles clicked with barely contained amusement, raised a serrated appendage. "Professor, surely this is a juvenile specimen. Where are the venom sacs? The electromagnetic discharge organs?" "Observe the dental structure," continued Vexka, ignoring the question with professional disdain. "Omnivorous grinding surfaces. No piercing fangs, no digestive acids, no paralytic secretions. The human represents perhaps the most overrated intelligent species in the known galaxy." The classroom erupted in chittering, buzzing, and harmonized laughter. Cadet Torak, whose 6 eyes blinked in sequential patterns of mirth, tapped his thermal-sensitive proboscis against his desk. "My homeworld's children wouldn't flee from such a creature. How did they achieve spaceflight without basic predatory adaptations?" "An excellent question." Vexka's crystalline structure brightened with academic satisfaction. "It demonstrates the galaxy's tendency toward pity rather than proper evolutionary assessment. Humans survive through cooperation, tool use, and what their primitive literature calls perseverance." The way he pronounced the word made it sound like a particularly embarrassing bodily function. In the back corner of the classroom, where shadows collected like forgotten thoughts, Cadet Quinn sat with the peculiar stillness that marked her species. Most of the other students had learned to ignore the human's presence. She rarely spoke, never volunteered answers, and had an unsettling habit of watching everything with those forward-facing eyes that evolutionary biologists classified as pursuit-predator configuration. "Of course," Vexka continued, warming to his theme like a fusion reactor approaching critical mass, "Earth itself presents no significant apex predators. Their largest carnivore, the polar bear, weighs a mere 800 kilograms. Compare this to the void hunters of Kepler 442b, which achieve masses of 12,000 kilograms and hunt through dimensional space." Cadet Zilith, whose purple scales rippled with the electromagnetic equivalent of laughter, gestured toward the holographic display. "What about their mythological creatures? Surely primitive species develop legends based on actual predatory threats?" "Precisely why their mythology proves their weakness," Vexka's form pulsed with professorial smugness. "Dragons, werewolves, vampires, all clearly compensatory fantasies for a species that never faced genuine existential predation. Their fiction reveals a deep psychological need to imagine threats their world never actually produced." The laughter grew louder. Even the methane breathers in their environmental suits were producing the gaseous equivalent of Snickers, their containment systems hissing with amusement. "One could argue," Vexka continued, "that humans developed intelligence precisely because they lacked proper predatory equipment, a kind of evolutionary consolation prize." That was when Quinn spoke, her voice cutting through the classroom noise like a monofilament blade through tissue paper. "One still sleeps under my bed." The laughter stopped, as if someone had thrown a dampening field over the entire room. 24 alien gazes swiveled toward the human in the corner, who continued staring at the holographic display with the same unsettling focus she'd maintained throughout the lecture. Vexca's prismatic structure shifted through several confused color patterns before settling on a shade that might have been academic irritation. "I beg your pardon, Cadet Quinn?" "An apex predator," Quinn repeated, still not looking at her classmates. "One still sleeps under my bed." Cadet Torak's 6 eyes performed an elaborate blinking sequence that translated roughly to bewildered amusement. "Are you suggesting that adult humans maintain childhood fears of imaginary creatures?" "Oh, it's not imaginary." The way she said it, flat, matter-of-fact, like commenting on cafeteria schedules, sent something that wasn't quite silence but wasn't quite sound rippling through the classroom. Several students shifted in their seats, though none could have explained why. Professor Vexca's academic composure, which had survived 17 years of teaching xenobiology to teenagers from 47 different species, began showing stress fractures. "Cadet Quinn, are you perhaps referring to some kind of domesticated companion animal? Earth mammals do have a tendency toward—" "No," Quinn interrupted, finally turning those forward-facing eyes toward the front of the classroom. "Not domesticated, not a companion, apex predator, still sleeps under my bed." Zeph-9's mandibles clicked in what passed for nervous laughter among his species. "But you said still. Present tense. Surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said." The classroom's environmental systems hummed in the growing quiet. Outside the reinforced windows, 3 moons hung in the artificial night of the Academy's rotation, casting overlapping shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Cadet Zilith's scales had shifted from purple to a muddy brown that indicated deep confusion. "But if Earth's apex predators were real, where are they? Why haven't we encountered them in first contact protocols? Why aren't they represented in your military or diplomatic corps?" Quinn's mouth curved upward in what might have been a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Who says you haven't encountered them?" Professor Vexca's crystalline matrix was now cycling through colors that hadn't been observed in his species for several millennia, shades that ancient texts described as deep unease and the recognition of fundamental error. "Cadet Quinn," his voice had lost its professorial smugness and gained something that sounded almost like caution. "Are you suggesting that humanity's actual apex predators have been concealed from galactic contact?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Professor. I'm telling you that one sleeps under my bed. Has since I was 6 years old. Still does, 23 years later." She paused, as if considering whether to elaborate. Though sleeps might not be the right word. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet of academic contemplation. It was the kind of silence that fell when prey animals sensed something watching from the undergrowth. Something patient, something intelligent, something that understood the value of waiting for exactly the right moment. "Perhaps," Professor Vexca said carefully, his prismatic form now displaying colors that his species hadn't needed, since they'd evolved past having natural predators. "You could elaborate on this arrangement?" Quinn leaned back in her chair with the casual movement of someone utterly comfortable with being the most dangerous thing in the room. "Where would you like me to start?" Quinn's fingers drummed against her desk in a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat, if hearts beat with the measured patience of something accustomed to long hunts. The classroom's atmospheric recyclers kicked in, stirring the air in ways that made several students unconsciously check the shadows behind them. "My parents were colonial engineers," she began, her voice carrying the same unsettling calm as before. "Third-wave settlement on Kepler 438b. We called it New Montana, though it looked nothing like the historical records suggested the original resembled." Cadet Brick 7, whose photosynthetic patches had been a healthy green throughout the lecture, was slowly shifting toward the yellow that indicated stress in his species. But Kepler 438b was classified as uninhabited. The survey teams found no sentient life, no apex fauna above Class 2 threat levels. Survey teams, Quinn repeated, and something in her tone suggested that survey teams might not have been particularly thorough. Funny how survey teams always manage to miss the important details, like how the local fauna had learned to hide from ships with scanning equipment. Professor Vex Ka's prismatic structure was now displaying colors that his academic colleagues would have found deeply concerning. Cadet Quinn, are you implying that Earth's colonial expansion encountered resistance from indigenous predators that weren't reported to the Galactic Settlement Bureau? I'm not implying anything about resistance. Quinn's forward-facing eyes tracked to the window, where the Academy's 3 moons cast their overlapping shadows. I'm talking about cooperation. The word hung in the recycled air, like a toxin nobody had equipped themselves to filter. Cadet Torek's 6 eyes had stopped their usual coordinated blinking patterns, and were now focusing on Quinn, with the intensity his species reserved for identifying immediate threats. Cooperation suggests intelligence. Formal surveys indicated Kepler 438b fauna possessed no cognitive capabilities above basic pack hunting. Formal surveys, Quinn said, conducted by teams that landed during daylight hours, stayed in designated safe zones, and left before the local ecosystem decided whether they were interesting. She leaned forward slightly, and despite the fact that humans were supposedly the least physically intimidating species in known space, every alien in the classroom found themselves leaning back. I was 6 when it first showed up. Standard Earth age, not planetary cycles. My bedroom was on the ground floor of our habitat module, and I kept complaining about noises coming from underneath during sleep periods. Zilith's scales had progressed from brown to a deep gray that indicated his species' version of existential dread. Structural settling, geothermal activity, colonial habitats often experience breathing, Quinn cut him off. Slow, deliberate breathing, and occasionally movement, like something large shifting position to get more comfortable. The environmental systems hummed louder, though that might have been because several students had unconsciously adjusted their respiratory rates and the atmosphere processors were compensating. My parents did what colonial parents do, she continued. Checked the foundation sensors, ran structural integrity scans, sealed every gap larger than a molecule. Nothing. But every night, the breathing continued. And sometimes, if I was very quiet, I could hear something else. Professor Vex Ka's academic training warred with something more primitive in his crystalline matrix. What else? Purring. The word dropped into the classroom like a depth charge in still water. Several students made involuntary sounds that their translators couldn't properly convert. The linguistic equivalent of biological revulsion mixed with the recognition of something fundamentally wrong with the universe. Purring, repeated Zeph 9, his mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested his species was accessing their emergency flight protocols. Like contentment? Like contentment, Quinn agreed, the sound of something large and potentially dangerous that had found exactly where it wanted to be. Brick 7's photosynthetic patches were now displaying yellow-green warning coloration. But surely your parents took protective measures, relocated your sleeping quarters, contacted colonial security? Quinn's mouth curved into that expression that wasn't quite a smile. They tried. Moved my bed to the upper level, installed additional sensors, even brought in an off-world security consultant who specialized in xenobiological intrusion events. And it followed me upstairs. Never made a sound during the transition. Never triggered a single sensor. One day I was sleeping on the second floor with nothing underneath except support beams and empty space. The next night, the breathing was back. The classroom's silence had evolved beyond mere quiet into something approaching the acoustic properties of deep space, empty, cold, and suggesting the presence of things that preferred not to be observed. Cadet Melax, whose species communicated primarily through electromagnetic pulses, had been silent throughout the lecture, but now generated a burst of static that roughly translated to, "How do you survive coexistence with an unknown apex predator for over 2 decades?" "That's the interesting part," Quinn said, settling back in her chair with the relaxed posture of someone who'd long ago made peace with forces beyond normal comprehension. "It never hurt me, never threatened me, never even revealed itself during my waking hours. Just stayed, like it had claimed the space underneath wherever I slept, and was perfectly content with the arrangement." Professor Vex-Ka's prismatic form was cycling through colors that might have been academic fascination wrestling with deep, instinctual terror. "Did you ever attempt direct contact? Visual confirmation of the entity?" "Once," Quinn said. "When I turned 16. Colonial age of majority thought I was old enough to handle whatever reality looked like." "And?" Her forward-facing eyes swept across the classroom, taking in each alien face with the same unsettling focus she'd maintained throughout her story. "I learned that some questions are much more comfortable left unanswered." The Academy's chronometer chimed the half-hour mark, but nobody moved. Professor Vex-Ka had abandoned any pretense of maintaining his lecture schedule, and the alien cadets sat frozen in their seats like specimens in his display cases, though considerably more terrified. Cadet Torak finally broke the crystallized tension. "You said you learned reality was uncomfortable. What did you actually see?" Quinn tilted her head, considering the question with the deliberate care of someone defusing an explosive device. "That's the wrong question." "Then what's the right one?" "What did it see when it looked at me?" The environmental systems cycled again, but this time the air seemed thicker rather than cleaner. Several students found themselves breathing manually, a disturbing reminder that most biological functions relied on subconscious trust in an orderly universe. "I spent 10 years sharing sleeping space with something I couldn't identify," Quinn continued. 10 years of peaceful coexistence with a creature that colonial surveys missed, security consultants couldn't detect, and military-grade sensors couldn't track. 10 years wondering why something with those capabilities chose to stay under my bed, instead of, say, eating me. Zeph-9's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. Never a good sign for his species. "Perhaps it wasn't large enough to consider you prey. Many predators ignore threats below a certain size threshold." Quinn's laugh was sharp enough to cut atmosphere. "Have you been paying attention to anything Professor Vex-Ka said about human mythology? Dragons, werewolves, vampires, all conveniently larger than us. Why would a species with no natural predators invent monsters specifically designed to hunt them?" The question hung in recycled air, like a probability equation nobody wanted to solve. "Because," she continued, "they weren't inventions. They were job descriptions." Professor Vex-Ka's prismatic structure was now displaying colors that suggested his species' equivalent of an academic nervous breakdown. "Job descriptions? Earth didn't produce weak predators, Professor. It produced specialized ones. Creatures that developed alongside humans instead of competing with them. What you call mythology, we call—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't send her classmates into complete psychological collapse. Employment history. Cadet Brick 7's photosynthetic patches were now flashing warning patterns that his homeworld used to signal planetary evacuations. "You're suggesting that humanity's legendary monsters were actual creatures that served specific functions in human society?" "Not served. Serve. Present tense." The grammatical correction hit the classroom like a small asteroid. "Dragons," Quinn said conversationally, as if discussing weather patterns, "are excellent at protecting large territories from unauthorized intrusion. Werewolves make outstanding reconnaissance specialists. Enhanced senses, pack coordination, ability to blend into civilian populations, and vampires." She smiled, and this time the expression definitely reached her eyes. "Vampires are remarkably good at what humans call information acquisition." Zelith's scales had progressed beyond gray into a color that didn't appear in any known xenobiological database, possibly because his species had never encountered stimuli this far outside their evolutionary comfort zone. But the energy requirements alone, the ecological impact of sustaining creatures of such size and capability. Who said they were large? The question reframed everything that had come before it. Every assumption about scale, every preconception about predator-prey dynamics, every comfortable certainty about how intelligent life organized itself across the galaxy. Quinn stood up from her desk. A simple movement that somehow made every alien in the room calculate distance to the nearest exit. "The thing under my bed isn't some massive beast that could physically overpower me," she explained, walking toward the front of the classroom with the casual stride of someone utterly confident in their environment. "It's something much more efficient than that." She stopped directly in front of Professor Vex Ka's holographic display, her human silhouette intersecting with the rotating image of Homo sapiens in ways that seemed deliberately symbolic. "It's something that learned humans are worth protecting." Cadet Malax's electromagnetic pulses were now generating interference patterns that roughly translated to, "Protection implies mutual benefit. What do humans provide in return?" "Excellent question," Quinn replied, apparently able to interpret electrical discharges as fluently as spoken language. "What's the one thing every advanced species needs but can never quite secure?" The classroom offered no answers, though several students were clearly running through databases of strategic resources, rare elements, and technological capabilities. "Safety," Quinn continued. "Not from external threats. Your militaries handle those adequately. Safety from the thing that destroys more advanced civilizations than war, plague, and resource depletion combined." Professor Vex Ka's academic training finally reasserted itself through his existential panic. "And what would that be?" "Boredom." The word landed with the impact of a small supernova. Every alien in the classroom began calculating the implications of a statement so simple it had to be profound or completely insane. "Advanced species reach technological peaks and stagnate," Quinn explained. "They solve their major problems, eliminate their natural challenges, create perfectly safe environments where nothing unexpected ever happens. They build paradises so secure and predictable that their inhabitants begin to deteriorate." She gestured toward the holographic human display. "But humans never get bored. Do you know why?" Nobody volunteered an answer. "Because there's always something interesting sleeping under our beds." The Academy's hull groaned softly as stellar winds buffeted the outer barriers, but inside the classroom, the only sound was the collective recalibration of 24 alien worldviews. Torak's 6 eyes performed a blinking sequence that indicated his species was accessing emergency philosophical protocols. "Are you suggesting that humanity has achieved a symbiotic relationship with apex predators specifically to maintain psychological engagement?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Quinn corrected. "I'm explaining why human colonies don't report indigenous predators to the Galactic Settlement Bureau, why our military forces consistently outperform theoretical capabilities, and why human settlements have the lowest rates of civilizational stagnation in recorded galactic history." She turned back toward her desk, then paused as if remembering something important. Oh, and why 29 human cadets are currently enrolled at this academy, but only I ever speak in xenobiology class. Professor Vex Ka's prismatic form flickered through several patterns before settling on a color that indicated deep, fundamental uncertainty about the nature of reality. Where are the other 28 cadets? Quinn's smile was now sharp enough to cut through dimensional barriers. That depends entirely on what you think sleeps under their beds. The Academy's communication systems chose that precise moment to announce evening meal service, but the cheerful automated voice seemed to be broadcasting from a different universe, one where xenobiology classes ended with normal discussions about carbon cycles and atmospheric composition, not existential revelations about the fundamental nature of human civilization. Professor Vex Ka's prismatic form had settled into a dull, static pattern that his species reserved for moments of complete cognitive recalibration. Cadet Quinn, you're suggesting that humanity has systematically concealed the existence of indigenous apex predators across multiple colony worlds? I'm not suggesting concealment, Quinn replied, gathering her academic materials with movements so casual they seemed deliberately provocative. I'm explaining selective disclosure. The distinction hit the classroom like a precision strike against their remaining assumptions about interspecies relations. Cadet Brix 7, whose photosynthetic patches were now displaying emergency patterns normally reserved for solar flares, raised a trembling appendage. But the galactic integration protocols require full biological disclosure for any species seeking advanced status. Read subsection 47 of the integration protocols, Quinn interrupted. Indigenous fauna reporting requirements specifically exclude domestic companion species and culturally integrated organisms. The silence that followed wasn't academic contemplation. It was the sound of bureaucratic loopholes being recognized for what they truly were. Domestic companions, repeated Zeph 9, his mandibles producing grinding sounds that indicated his species was accessing combat readiness subroutines. You're classifying apex predators as pets? Quinn paused at the classroom door, her hand resting on the activation panel. I'm classifying them as family. She triggered the door's opening sequence, but instead of stepping into the corridor, she turned back toward her classmates with an expression that managed to be simultaneously amused and predatory. Has anyone wondered why this academy accepts human applicants? The question restructured everything they thought they understood about their educational institution. 24 alien minds began frantically reassessing admission requirements, selection criteria, and the strategic implications of human presence in advanced military training. Thorax 6 Eyes performed a series of rapid calculations. Academic merit? Interspecies cooperation initiatives? Diplomatic outreach programs? All perfectly reasonable explanations, Quinn agreed. Also completely wrong. She stepped partially into the corridor, but her voice carried clearly back into the classroom. The Academy accepts human applicants because Admiral Kenth Var requested our presence specifically. Professor Vex Ka's academic training finally surrendered to pure investigative curiosity. Why would the Academy's commanding officer personally request human enrollment? Because 3 years ago, Admiral Kenth Var's flagship encountered what your tactical databases classify as a level Omega unidentified threat in the Vega system, something that disabled their weapons, bypassed their shields, and materialized on their command deck without triggering a single sensor. The classroom's environmental systems couldn't compensate for the collective drop in temperature that seemed to accompany this revelation. The entity didn't attack, Quinn continued conversationally. It didn't communicate. It simply observed the Admiral for approximately 47 seconds, then vanished exactly as it had appeared. No trace signatures, no residual energy patterns, no explanation for how something had accomplished tactical impossibilities. Zilith's scales were now displaying patterns that didn't exist in any xenobiological reference database. Colors that suggested his species was inventing new categories of terror in real time. The Admiral spent 6 months consulting military experts, xenobiological specialists, and theoretical physicists. Nobody could explain what had happened, how it was accomplished, or why the entity had chosen to observe rather than attack. Quinn smiled, and the expression contained depths that made interstellar space seem cozy by comparison. Then the Admiral met Captain Chen during a diplomatic function on Proxima Station. Casual conversation. Admiral mentioned the incident, described the entity's capabilities and behavior patterns. She paused, letting anticipation build like pressure in a fusion chamber. Captain Chen said, "Oh, that sounds like Morrison's kid. She mentioned her daughter's companion had gotten curious about military vessels. I'll ask her to keep it closer to home." The implications cascaded through the classroom like a strategic weapons demonstration. Every alien present began recalculating not just human capabilities, but the entire balance of galactic power. The Admiral realized, Quinn continued, that humanity possesses assets that galactic civilization has never encountered, never classified, and never developed countermeasures against. Assets that treat military-grade technology as minor inconveniences. Professor Vex Ka's prismatic structure was now displaying colors that suggested his species was questioning the fundamental stability of reality itself. And the Academy enrollment? Insurance policy, Quinn said simply. Human cadets provide early warning systems for threats the Admiral's sensors can't detect. We also serve as communication channels for negotiations with forces your military can't engage. She stepped fully into the corridor, but her final words echoed back into the classroom with the clarity of absolute certainty. Every human at this academy represents a different aspect of our species' relationship with what you call the impossible. My companion specializes in observation and territorial assessment. Cadet Rodriguez's partner handles temporal mechanics. Davis works with something your physics departments insist cannot exist. The door began its closing sequence, but Quinn's voice continued from the corridor. The Admiral keeps us close because the alternative is discovering what happens when human companions decide galactic civilization has become boring. The door sealed shut with finality that seemed more philosophical than mechanical. In the ensuing quiet, Professor Vex Ka stared at his holographic display of Homo sapiens, that supposedly primitive biped with its laughable lack of natural weaponry, and wondered if academic careers could survive the kind of fundamental revision his entire field now required. Outside the Academy's reinforced windows, 3 moons continued their orbital dance, casting shadows that moved according to celestial mechanics rather than conscious intent. Or so the Academy's navigation systems claimed. In the corridor beyond the sealed classroom, Quinn walked toward evening meal service with the relaxed stride of someone whose bedtime routine included checking that ancient powers were comfortable in their chosen resting places. Behind her, under 28 other beds scattered across the Academy's residential levels, things that shouldn't exist settled into patient waiting. Content in the knowledge that their humans were exactly where they needed to be. The galaxy's most advanced military institution had become humanity's largest sleepover party, and nobody in Galactic Command had realized the implications. Yet,